Today is a very special day because if you've been around me in any capacity, are probably aware that I've been going batshit crazy about the Trails series for what is probably the better part of 6, 7 years at this point. And as it just so happens, recently the newest entry in that series has been released. That would be Kuro no Kiseki. We're going to talk a little bit about the Trails series before I actually dive into what Kyoto is and how it connects to this series, just because it's a little bit important. It's not as important on the Trails of Cold Steel games, just because that's still its own technical series and it's continuing into the future. Kudo has a weird. It's like a weird lock between Trails of Cold Steel as a series and its own little series as well. I'm actually not terribly sure how much of it takes place in the past and how much of it takes place in the present. Because when Kudo was advertised, it was largely advertised as a game that took place alongside the Trails of Cold Steel series. However, in its release, that is clearly not the case. Let's go ahead and quickly. I'm going to quickly run through this using some visuals that I probably should have planned before I started the stream. First of all, let's do some quick run through on the history of the Kiseki series. What is the Kiseki series? This is a series that was started by the Nihon Falcom Company a long time ago, probably somewhere in the early uh probably somewhere in the early 2000s, maybe. I think it might be in the 90s. It originally started on the PC. This series has been around 20 years at this point. God, I think I can't even remember off the top of my head. I would need to look at it, and they just actually had their anniversary with the release of Kuro. And it's been around for quite some time. It focuses around. So the first game is Trails in the Sky. That's the game that I have up here. You can buy it on Steam. Trails in the Sky is a lighthearted adventure. It's a coming of age story, is what it is. But it's a coming of age story with a lot of intrigue in the background. And if you pay close attention, there's a lot of stuff happening in Trails in the Sky that you won't catch on your first playthrough, because it's all stuff that relates to the overall plot of this series, which we will get into in great detail as we continue. But this is the story of Estelle and Joshua Bright, who continue to be main characters throughout the series, becoming bracers. And bracers are kind of like mercenaries in this world. So Estelle and Joshua are gradually dragged into a plot that threatens the entire country of Liberl, which is where the game takes place. And that plot reveals a number of individuals by the name of Ouroboros, who are sort of like a shadow organization. It's not terribly clear at this point what they're trying to do. World domination is like flirted at. All right, so Trails in the Sky second chapter gets into a lot more plot. We're no longer telling a coming of age story. It's not as lighthearted as it was. It's a lot more realistic now. We're delving into the past of what's known as the Zemuria continent, which is the continent that all of these games take place in. And Zemuria is like a weird no man's land of like, it's a very strange place. It's a place that seems to have forgotten its own history. And what we learn in Trails in the Sky second chapter is that the Zemuria continent was once blessed with an ancient civilization that had these treasures known as the Septarians. And there was one Septarian for each element within the universe, and that's nigh on probably 8, 9, maybe 10 off the top of my head. I'm bullshitting that. It's probably not 10. So there's a number of elements in the universe, and each of these are treasures, and they all have respective control over their domain. I'll go into that a little bit later. It's not as important as Trails in the Sky second chapter, but what we find out in second chapter is that these treasures are actually very much still active today, and they are wreaking some very real havoc. And Ouroboros' goal seems to be to gather them up. Nobody really knows why they want them. Nobody really knows what they're trying to do with them, but they want these treasures. So Ouroboros activates Liberal Septarian. Oh, Oh, hi, Radu. Thank you so much for the raid. You're just in time for our history lesson. Hello, Raiders. My name is Dom. I'm a dogboy who plays JRPGs and visual novels and horror games. And right now we are learning about the Kiseki series. just before we start Kuro no Kiseki. They activate the liberal Septarian. The Septarian does some things. I'm not going to spoil these games, by the way. I'm going to tell you like the very briefest points of plot, but I'm not going to tell you who does what and why, and I'm not going to spoil like major events like character deaths, things like that. I'm not going to do that. But because I very much want people to play these games. But I do want you to have some background just so that you understand what this is all about. The Septarian does some things, and then the Septarian is shut off, so to speak. And after that, there's a grand investigation by a body known as the Gralsritter, which are another shadowy organization that we don't know very much about at this point, but we do see a character in the Gralsritter whom is an important part of the third game. And you're not actually supposed to know that he's part of the Gralsritter until the very end, but it's kind of important for this discussion, so I'm just saying it straight out. I'm not going to say anything else about him, though. And that brings us to the third game in this series. So in Trails in the Sky, second chapter, we learned about the quote-unquote Septarians. And in the third game in the series, we have a different set of characters. We're following Kevin and Ries Argent, two members of the church who are drawn into what is essentially a parallel universe. It's very hard to explain what exactly Trails in the Sky the Third is about without spoiling the entire game, so I'm not going to do that. What I am going to say is this game illuminates a lot of the inner workings of this series. It talks a lot about the Septarians. It talks a lot about Ouroboros as an organization. It reveals character pasts. It reveals reasons and motivations for different organizations throughout Cimmeria. And not only that, it also tells the future. The reason why Trails in the Sky the Third is so important is because you get so much context for events that happen in Trails of Cold Steel in this game. And for a long time, this game did not even exist overseas. So much of this stuff was like discussed on GameFAQs boards and stuff like that. And people in the US were very confused because like there's stuff hinted at in Trails of Cold Steel that people who played like Trails in the Sky the Third were like, oh yeah, you find out about that in the third game. And as you can see, I played this for 93 hours. It's a very fucking long game. So that's Trails in the Sky the Third. We find out from Trails in the Sky the Third that there are these items that the church seeks called artifacts. And what artifacts do, they're not really Septarians. They kind of have like minds of their own. Each of them has a very weird effect. And we see them throughout the course of the Kiseki series doing different things. But that's all we're going to talk about for now, because we're going to get into the artifacts a little bit sooner with Trails of Cold Steel. So that was the story of Estelle and Joshua Bright. Now, you might be wondering, what the hell happens to Estelle and Joshua? Well, there is two other games in this series known as the Zero and Ow games, and those take place in a country called Crossbell. Those are not released overseas, so I'm just going to briefly tell you what those are about without spoilers, and we'll go from there because they are very important to this particular series, which talks about them throughout the entire 4 fucking games. Zero and Ow. Zero no Kiseki is about an organization called the SSS, which takes on a cult, which dates back to the time of that ancient civilization we talked about before. That cult behind the scenes is trying to organize something for Crossbell's independence, but they also are trying to do something far more nefarious than that. And I'm not really going to explain what that is just because it's heavily contextual to that game itself, and I don't really want to say things that I don't really have full context for, because it's very confusing. Even I've spoiled all of these games, but it's still very confusing if you don't play it without understanding text. Anyway, so Crossbell does some stuff, that cult does some things, and then we're pretty much set up for a fight for Crossbell's independence in Ao no Kiseki, which utilizes yet another Septarian to try and break free of the country of Erebonia. Now, Erebonia is important in Trails in the Sky, just less so, just because they're kind of on the back burner. They did do some things relating to the plot of those games, but they don't really come into focus until Trails of Cold Steel. I will note now that Zero no Kiseki and Ao no Kiseki take place simultaneously with the Cold Steel games. So at the same time as we have the first part of Zero no Kiseki, we have the first part of Trails of Cold Steel, and they just proceed throughout that point in time. Trails of Cold Steel starts a little bit before Zero no Kiseki because the first big event of Zero no Kiseki is an international conference that happens with the individuals across Lemuria, and then the events of the two games start to kind of overlap a little bit. Trails of Cold Steel tells the story of Rien Schwarzer, who is a student who has been selected for Class 7, which is a controversial class throughout the country of Erebonia because Erebonia is largely a country that's ruled by nobles. Class 7 sort of turns out to be a revolutionary concept, not quite a coup d'etat per se, more like a we're trying to change the status quo in Erebonia sort of thing. Rien gets dragged into a lot of different plots relating to a terrorist organization that's threatening the peace of Erebonia by trying to stoke a civil war. And basically by the end of Trails of Cold Steel, we've not only started a civil war, but we've also uncovered quite a bit more about the septarian weird stuff that's going on in the form of there's actually Gundams now. Yes, there are Gundams now, and we'll go into that later. So moving right along, Trails of Cold Steel 2. So the Civil War starts in Trails of Cold Steel. Trails of Cold Steel 2, Rien is fighting the Civil War. He's fighting some of his classmates. He's fighting some of the party members that we had in the first game. All this entire game, you have no fucking idea what's actually going on behind the scenes until the very end of this game, where it is revealed that this whole time the terrorist organization has kind of been trying to defeat a great evil in Erebonia that was defeated like centuries ago, predating that ancient civilization that we talked about before. And they sort of succeed, but then they also fail. As it turns out, there was another plot that was working its way around the terrorist organization that was very much aware of the terrorist organization's activities. And there's a lot of context here that's missing because a lot of this is in the Zero and Ao games, which we don't have context for because they're not overseas. So I'm going to skip all that. And basically what happens at the end of Trails of Cold Steel 2 is Rien kind of becomes a terrible person. A little bit. He sort of becomes a villain. Kinda. He is kind of charged with fighting on behalf of the Empire to save Erebonia's way of life, so to speak. So the Civil War kind of evolves into this greater thing, and as a result of the Civil War, there's some other stuff that breaks out in other parts of Zemuria. And Rien just kind of becomes the government's lapdog. So that brings us to Trails of Cold Steel 3. In Trails of Cold Steel 3, we're still playing as Rien, but Rien's done some shit. He has seen some things. He's traumatized. There's a lot of stuff that he's done as the Ashen Chevalier, as the government's lapdog, that he doesn't want to talk about. But he's also leading his own class of he's leading his own class of newbies to try and become the new Class 7. So that idea of social change is still very much alive. What's also very much alive is a plot that sort of played in part of the terrorist organization, but is also not really linked to the terrorist organization itself. That plot was usurped by a certain individual in Trails of Cold Steel 2 who's a very massive spoiler, and I'm not going to say his name. And basically what that plot's aim is, it appears that that plot is to destroy Erebonia. Now, as this game goes on, you realize that the plot is not actually to destroy Erebonia, it's to liberate Erebonia. We find out that Erebonia's undergone some very old curse. I'm not going to say much more about that curse because it spoils the entire end of the game, but basically it's a curse that has changed Erebonia. We find out that much of Erebonia is fabricated. It's not anything like what it appeared to be. And there's a lot of darkness hidden in Erebonia's past that needs to be excised in order for it to continue on into the future. And much of Trails of Cold Steel 3 is setting up the stage for that final confrontation to excise that darkness. And Rien does it in the worst way possible. Alright, now we're moving to Trails of Cold Steel 4. And Trails of Cold Steel 4, Rien has become a prisoner of Erebonia because of the actions that he performed in Trails of Cold Steel 3. And a lot of this game is the members of the old Class 7 and the new Class 7 trying to team up to not just bring Reen back, but also to end a lot of the shadow things that are happening in Erebonia on behalf of the organization that is leading the charge on this so-called exorcism, and also some other stuff that's happening on the side having to do with the country of Calvard, and we will go back to that in a bit, having to do with a Septarian known as the Septarians of Earth and Steel. And we won't, sorry, not the Septarians of Earth and Steel, the Septarians of Earth and Fire, which combine to create the Septarian of Steel. The Septarian of Steel is, as you can imagine, because these are natural elements, not something that should exist. And because it exists, it has corrupted a large part of Erebonia right down to the land itself. So, in the end of Trails of Cold Steel 4, we finally defeat said curse, Reen gets his life back, and everything seemingly seems okay as far as Erebonia is concerned. And then we move to Hajimari no Kiseki. Hajimari no Kiseki is not on Steam, as far as, let me make sure. Oh, it is. Okay. This is Hajimari no Kiseki. We played Hajimari no Kiseki on stream. So this game is the sequel of the Cold Steel series. It takes place in the future. You play as both the SSS and you play as also Class 7 and another group of individuals, which I won't talk about because spoilers. This game, I don't want to spoil it just because I'm going to be playing through it again whenever it comes stateside. Basically, what happened is when the Septarian of Steel was defeated, it awakened a force in the land of Zemuria which has become self-aware to the point at which it started to calculate the things needed to perpetuate its own existence. And it gets to the point where this thing becomes so threatening to the world that it actually starts launching, I'm not going to say nuclear weapons, but it is the Kiseki equivalent of nuclear weapons onto the world itself in a grand bid to annihilate everything. And there's a whole reason for this that I'm not touching because it's hugely spoilers. But in the end, that self-aware thing is defeated, and we seem to sort of regain some amount of peace throughout the continent of Zemuria. But at the same time as this is happening, there's some major shit going down in the country of Calvard. And we haven't talked much about Calvard at all because Calvard happens throughout the entire course of the Cold Steel series. There's stuff going on in Calvard, there's international struggles going on, there's all kinds of secret plots going on, there seems to be shadowy soldiers that infiltrated Erebonia for who knows why. And those are the focus of Kuro no Kiseki. Kuro no Kiseki takes place in the country of Calvard. We're going to be following individuals who are allied with, I don't think they're allied with the government of Calvard, but like an organization that's like government adjacent. And we're going to get some of the backstory behind what's actually going on in the country of Calvard, how it relates to Trails of Cold Steel, into Trails of Reverie, and into Trails into Reverie, and what exactly the consequences of it are. Because like I said, part of Kuro must take place in the past and must take place in the present because of characters that are in it. And that concludes our explanation. That was probably long and drawn out and a little bit more confusing than it needed to be, but I do hope that you are a little bit more clear on what this series is about now that I have gone through it. I do want to just reiterate again, I didn't put spoilers into this discussion at all because I want everybody to experience these games from the start to the finish. And as of Kuro, there are 9 of them. I think there might be 10, I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, with that done, let's start Kuro.